The envelope trembled in Dr. Phil's hands. For 15 years, the Henderson family had searched for answers about their missing father. Now, in this studio, surrounded by cameras and a hushed audience, the truth was sealed inside a manila folder that felt heavier than anything Dr. Phil had ever held. His face, usually composed and confident, showed something rare, genuine shock. He looked at the mother, whose hands were pressed against her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. He looked at the daughter, frozen in her seat, and the son, whose jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. "I need to stop for a moment," Dr. Phil said, his voice lower than usual. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone in the studio knew something was about to break open. Something that would change this family forever. 15 years earlier, on a warm September evening, Michael Henderson kissed his wife goodnight, told his 2 children he loved them, and walked out the front door to grab milk from the convenience store 3 blocks away. He never came back. The police investigated. Friends organized search parties. His face appeared on missing person flyers stapled to telephone poles across 3 counties. But Michael Henderson had simply vanished, leaving behind a wife, a 10-year-old daughter, and a 2-year-old son who would grow up with only photographs of a father he couldn't remember. Sharon Henderson, Michael's wife, spent years oscillating between hope and despair. She kept his clothes in the closet. She maintained his side of the bed. She answered every unknown phone call thinking it might be him. Their daughter, Emily, became the surrogate parent to her younger brother, Jake, sacrificing her teenage years to help her mother hold the family together. Jake grew up in the shadow of a ghost, constantly compared to a father he never knew, told he had. His father's eyes, and his father's smile, by relatives who meant well but only deepened the wound. The case went cold. Detectives moved on to newer cases. The media stopped calling. Life, as it does, continued without pause. But the question remained, hanging over the Henderson family like a storm cloud that never broke: what happened to Michael Henderson? Then, 6 months ago, Sharon received a letter. No return address. Postmarked from a town 2 states away. Inside was a single sentence, handwritten in shaky cursive. "Your husband is alive, and I know where he is." Sharon didn't sleep for 3 days. She hired a private investigator who traced the letter to a woman named Margaret Sullivan, a former nurse who had worked at a psychiatric facility in rural Montana. Margaret agreed to speak with Sharon on one condition: that it happened on the Dr. Phil show, where the truth could be told publicly, where there could be witnesses, where the weight of 15 years of lies could finally be lifted. Dr. Phil's production team vetted the story for weeks. They verified Margaret's identity, confirmed her employment history, and conducted preliminary interviews. What they discovered was so unexpected, so emotionally complex, that even the seasoned producers who had seen thousands of cases felt unprepared. This wasn't a story about a man who abandoned his family. It wasn't about infidelity or criminality. It was about something far more devastating: a medical tragedy, a bureaucratic failure, and a family that had been robbed of 15 years they could never get back. Now, in the studio, with the cameras rolling and the audience holding its collective breath, Dr. Phil held the envelope containing the medical records, the official documents, and the photographs that would finally answer the question that had haunted the Henderson family for a decade and a half. "Sharon," Dr. Phil said, his voice measured but filled with an unusual gravity. "Before I open this, I need you to understand something. What's in here is going to change everything you've believed for 15 years. It's going to make you angry. It's going to break your heart. But it's also going to give you answers." Sharon nodded, unable to speak. Emily reached over and gripped her mother's hand. Jake sat perfectly still, his teenage face trying to mask the terror of finally knowing. Dr. Phil opened the envelope. He pulled out a stack of papers, medical charts with official hospital letterheads, photographs that were clearly taken in a clinical setting, and a handwritten letter that appeared old and worn from repeated reading. He scanned the documents quickly, his expression shifting from professional composure to something raw. He looked up at the family, then at Margaret Sullivan, who sat on the opposite side of the stage, her own face streaked with tears. "Margaret," Dr. Phil said, turning to her. I need you to tell this family what you told my producers. I need you to tell them what happened on September 12th, 15 years ago. Margaret took a shaky breath. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the stage lights. I was working the night shift at County General Hospital, Margaret began, her voice trembling. Around 9:47 p.m., paramedics brought in a man who had been found unconscious near the interstate. No ID. No wallet. Just the clothes on his back. He had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. The doctors stabilized him, but when he woke up 3 days later... She paused, struggling to continue. He didn't remember who he was. He couldn't tell us his name. He couldn't tell us where he lived or if he had a family. He had complete retrograde amnesia. The audience gasped. Sharon's hand flew to her chest. Emily began to cry silently. Jake's face remained frozen, processing information his brain couldn't quite accept. That man, Margaret continued, her voice breaking, was Michael Henderson. But we didn't know that. We had no way to identify him. His fingerprints weren't in any database. No one reported him missing in our jurisdiction because it was 2 counties away from where he actually lived. He became what we call a John Doe. Patient 7743. And because he had no memory and no identification, after 6 months of medical treatment, he was transferred to a long-term psychiatric care facility for patients with severe amnesia and cognitive disorders. Dr. Phil's jaw tightened. And in 15 years, no one thought to cross-reference missing persons reports from neighboring jurisdictions? It's a failure of the system, Margaret said, her voice thick with guilt. Multiple agencies, poor communication, underfunded hospitals, overworked staff. Michael fell through every crack in the system. And by the time I realized who he might be, after I saw a documentary about long-term missing persons cases and recognized his face from an old news clip, it had been 15 years. Sharon's composure finally shattered. She doubled over in her chair, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. Emily wrapped her arms around her mother, crying into her shoulder. Jake stood up, turned away from the cameras, and pressed his palms against his eyes. Dr. Phil made a decision in that moment that would later be described by his producers as one of the most powerful things they had ever witnessed him do. He held up his hand, looked directly at the control room, and said, "Stop the cameras." The red recording lights blinked off. The audience, trained to remain silent during filming, began to murmur. Dr. Phil walked over to the Henderson family, knelt down in front of Sharon, and spoke to her in a voice so low only those immediately nearby could hear. He handed her tissues. He waited until her breathing steadied. He looked at Emily and Jake and said something that made Jake finally break down and cry. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. After several minutes, Dr. Phil stood up, returned to his position, and nodded to the control room. The cameras began rolling again. But something had shifted. The performance aspect of television, the entertainment element that even the most serious talk shows carry, had been stripped away. What remained was raw, human truth. "Sharon," Dr. Phil said gently, "your husband is alive. He's been alive this entire time. He's currently in a care facility in Montana, and according to the medical reports I have here, he has shown no recovery of his memories from before the accident. He doesn't remember you. He doesn't remember his children. He doesn't remember his life before that night. Can we see him?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Phil nodded. "That's why we're here. Margaret has been working with the facility and with my team to arrange a meeting. But I need all 3 of you to understand something crucial. The Michael Henderson you remember may not be the man you meet. 15 years of amnesia, 15 years of institutional living, 15 years of not knowing who he is, that changes a person. He may look like your husband, like your father, but he won't know you." "I don't care," Sharon said, her voice suddenly strong despite the tears. "I don't care if he doesn't remember. I just need to know he's alive. I just need to see him." Dr. Phil looked at Jake. Son, you were 2 years old when your father disappeared. You don't have any real memories of him. Are you ready for this? Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I've spent my whole life wondering if he left because of me. If I did something wrong. If I wasn't good enough to make him stay. Now I know he didn't leave. He didn't choose to go. That's enough. That's more than enough. The audience, which had been instructed to remain silent, began to applaud. Not the polite, orchestrated applause of television, but something genuine and spontaneous. Several audience members were crying. Dr. Phil himself had to take a moment to compose himself. Here's what's going to happen, Dr. Phil said, his voice regaining its characteristic authority. My team has arranged for all of you to fly to Montana tomorrow. You will meet with Michael at the care facility, under the supervision of medical professionals who specialize in amnesia and family reunification. Margaret will be there. I will be there. We're going to take this one step at a time, with no cameras, no pressure, and no expectations. This isn't about creating a TV moment. This is about giving a family back something that was stolen from them. He pulled out 3 items from a folder on his desk, 2 tickets, a care facility brochure, and a photograph. This photograph was taken last week. It's Michael today. Sharon took the photograph with trembling hands. Emily and Jake leaned in to see. The man in the picture was older, grayer, thinner. But the eyes were the same. The shape of the face was the same. It was him. He's alive, Sharon whispered, touching the photograph as if it might disappear. He's really alive. Dr. Phil nodded. He's alive. And tomorrow, you're going to see him. But Sharon, I need you to prepare yourself. He's going to look at you like a stranger. He's going to look at Emily and Jake and feel nothing. That's not because he stopped loving you. It's because his brain was injured in a way that erased you from his memory. But here's what I believe, love isn't just memory. Love is something deeper. And when you walk into that room tomorrow, you're going to show him what it means to be loved even when you can't remember being loved. The episode ended with the Henderson family standing together, holding each other, looking at the photograph of Michael. The audience gave them a standing ovation. Margaret Sullivan, who had carried the guilt of the system's failure for months, was also crying, but with visible relief on her face. But the story didn't end there. Off camera, after the taping finished, Dr. Phil spent 2 hours with the Henderson family in his office. He brought in a neurologist who specialized in traumatic brain injuries to explain the medical realities of Michael's condition. He brought in a family therapist who helped prepare Emily and Jake for the emotional complexity of meeting a father who wouldn't recognize them. He personally called the care facility director to ensure that the reunion would be handled with maximum sensitivity and professional support. 3 days later, Dr. Phil and his team flew to Montana with the Henderson family. The reunion was not filmed. No cameras were present. What happened in that room was private, sacred, and belonged only to the family. Michael Henderson looked at his wife, his daughter, and his son with polite confusion. He didn't know them. But Sharon held his hand and told him stories about their life together. Emily showed him photographs. Jake, who had never known his father, simply sat beside him and said, "I'm your son. And even if you don't remember me, I'm not going anywhere." Something shifted in Michael's expression. Not memory. Not recognition. But something else. A feeling, perhaps. An instinct. The neurologist later explained that even when explicit memory is destroyed, emotional memory can sometimes persist in fragments, in sensations, in inexplicable comfort with certain voices or faces. Michael looked at Sharon and said, "You feel familiar. I don't know why, but you feel like home." It was enough. It wasn't what they had hoped for, but it was more than they had dared to dream during 15 years of not knowing. 6 months after that meeting, Michael Henderson was released from the care facility into a specialized group home closer to his family. Sharon visits him 3 times a week. Emily brings her baby daughter to meet the grandfather who doesn't remember his own past but smiles every time they walk through the door. Jake, now in college, calls him every Sunday. Michael still doesn't remember his old life. But he's building a new one, surrounded by people who refuse to let him be alone again. Dr. Phil keeps the envelope on his desk as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. It just gives you a different kind of prison to escape from. But it's better to know. It's always better to know. The Henderson family didn't get their old life back. But they got something else, a second chance to love someone who couldn't remember being loved. And that, Dr. Phil told them on their last day in Montana, might be the purest form of love that exists. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten.